You can imagine the scene. It's springtime. The grass is plentiful and myriads of wild flowers are shaking gently in the breeze. It's a perfect time and place for a picnic. The word picnic has very powerful resonances for me. As a child, I used to love picnics outside in the sun, and sometimes when it was wet on a Sunday afternoon, the coffee table in the living room would be moved aside and a blanket would be put down on the sitting room floor, and we'd have, as it were, a picnic together. It was the same food we would normally have at tea time, but somehow as a picnic it seemed so very special. But in this case, beautiful weather, beautiful sunshine, beautiful landscape, but alas, there's barely any food, and there's a large multitude of people to be fed. These are people who have been so amazed and overwhelmed by Jesus' miracles or signs, as John the Evangelist calls them, that they follow Jesus without taking enough food. You might say, silly people. So here we are presented with what at first glance appears an idyllic scene, but already there are problems. And then there is the mention by John of the feast of the Passover. He says, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Now the evangelist never adds these details without wishing to make some point or other. By mentioning the feast of the Passover, the evangelist links the miraculous feeding of the multitude with the Passover itself. That's when the people of Israel were liberated from bondage in Egypt, journeying through the wilderness to the promised land, and fed with bread from heaven, manna, as recounted in Exodus. But the mention of the feast of the Passover has added resonances in John. The next Passover, Jesus will be in Jerusalem, where he will be crucified. Now, in trying to make sense of the significance, the cosmic significance of the passion, death, and resurrection of one man, Jesus Christ, early Christians used the story of the Exodus as a framework. So there's a connection between the Exodus story and what happened on Golgotha. The salvation brought about by Jesus on the cross is a liberation from the slavery of sin, a deeper captivity than even that of the Israelites in Egypt. So we have a rich set of ingredients in today's gospel reading. Allusions to the Exodus story of liberation from bondage and a miraculous feeding with manna. Allusions to Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. And of course, a miraculous feeding by Jesus of a hungry multitude. And by the way, it is clear from that what is recounted in the Gospels was a miraculous feeding and not simply something to be explained away along the lines of that Jesus got the hungry multitude to empty their pockets and to share the food that they had been squirreling away. Of course, an obvious way to interpret today's Gospel reading is in terms of the Eucharist, especially since John's Gospel does not have a narrative of the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper, as the other evangelists have. It seems compelling to me that John intends the account of the miraculous feeding of the multitude and most of the rest of chapter 6, with its talk of the bread of life, as an extended theological reflection on the Eucharist. But what special insights does John give? Well, how much time do you have? We're limited, of course, to one sermon today. Well, and we've also only heard a fraction of chapter 6 just a few moments ago. But nonetheless, this portion of chapter 6 gives us an awful lot to reflect upon. Let me just give you a few points that struck me when preparing this sermon that might be of interest and assistance to you. One fairly obvious point is that the feeding is miraculous and that the initiative for this came from Jesus himself, not from the hungry throng or the worried disciples, as one might have expected. This reminds us that while we might reach out to God, it is always God who comes to us first. Indeed, the grace that gets us to call out to God in the first place is itself ultimately a gift from God. You see, the grace of God has a primacy. It initiates in our hearts the journey of salvation in which we can, by the grace of God, actively participate. And the grace of God can bring about a depth of liberation beyond our natural powers. So when we come to the Eucharist, whether physically at Mass or through spiritual communion, we should remember that we receive a gift that has been initiated by Christ, and we come because it heals us in ways that we are incapable of bringing about by our own powers and activities. Our sense of apparent self-sufficiency might blind us to this, but the hungry multitude away from obvious sources of food did not have the luxury of pretending to be self-sufficient. They needed help, and they knew it. And every time we receive the Eucharist, we are in effect saying that we too are no different. We all need God's grace, whether we realize it fully or not. Another point that struck me is how much bounty came from such small, meager resources. With 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, Christ was able to feed so many so plentifully that there were no fewer than 12 baskets full of leftovers. We too, coming to the Eucharist, again, whether physically in person or through spiritual communion, might find ourselves struggling with insufficient resources, whether material and or spiritual. Think, for example, of parishes across the land struggling with low morale, struggling with leaky roofs, heating systems that do not work properly, very meager parish bank balance, and a congregation made up of people themselves coping with an awful lot. Or think of the many parents struggling to keep family life going, perhaps when money is very tight and the job situation is unsure. The children are being pulled about by various allurements and pressures. Or think of the person who is struggling with poor health, whether physical and or mental, who tries hard to keep their head above water with little or no spare capacity. Resources of all kinds can be scarce, sometimes very scarce indeed. The miracle of the miraculous feeding and the gift of the Eucharist at every Mass is a reminder to us that we come to the Lord with what we have, our meager resources like the boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And we are to hand them over to the Lord and ask him to transform them. Christ can transform mere bread and wine into heavenly food, and he can transform the all too ordinary and meager things of our lives too. It is here that the infinitely profound paradox of the cross kicks in, that it might be precisely at such challenging, seemingly inauspicious, even dull and dreary and dispiriting times that the grace of God might be most active and truly bountiful, and that a type of glory might be most present, even if it is a kind of glory like the glory of Christ on the cross that can only be seen through the eyes of faith. In one of his sermons, the medieval Dominican Meister Eckhart makes what might come across as a throwaway remark that I think has great depth. He says, "What is previously an obstacle to you is now a great help. Had it not been for the obstacle of a shortage of food, there would have been no miracle. There would not have been the opportunity for the workings of divine grace to be so manifest. In more general terms, There can be times when we encounter all sorts of obstacles, but if they are approached, or if we do our best to approach them in a creative and loving way, trusting in God, then something good might come from them. What is previously an obstacle to you is now a great help. Eckhart's point was not that we should put up with anything. There are times when we need to sort out and confront problems. But all the same, it is not too difficult to come up with examples of the sort of thing Eckhart might have meant. It could be, for example, how we deal with those whom we find difficult or unappealing. They could be, in a sense, obstacles to us, but our encounters with them are also opportunities to grow in love and as followers of Christ. What is previously an obstacle to you is now a great help. And in some respects, today's gospel reading is an illustration of this point. There is so much that can be said about this gospel passage, a rich and moving reflection on the gift of the Eucharist and its significance, and a source of inspiration and encouragement to help us as we go about our daily lives.